So I will introduce our speakers, so Stephen you would have heard this morning, so he doesn't need any more introduction. For those of you who missed it, Stephen's coming to the end of the year in Australia and going back to University of Limerick very soon. Shane Oliver is certainly known to everyone, Chief Economist of AMP, and regularly in our media on the television. Stephen actually told me an interesting story while we were waiting, that when he first started to getting to do some writing, he had a period of writer's block, and he was sort of sharing this with his father, and his father said to him, well lad, I'm a taxi driver, and I tell you, I've never had any taxi driver block, so bloody well get on with it, okay? And if you're wondering why that Irish father has a Pommy accent, you can work it out. So just a bit of a definition issue with next downturn coming, because if you look in your brochure, it actually talks about when is the next GFC coming. We're not going to go to that extreme about a GFC, at least initially. When we talk about a downturn, we're talking about the next recession and then sort of consequences for equity markets. If you remember the GFC, 10 years ago, we actually in that climate were really wondering, will the market continue to exist? Will the banking system continue to exist the way we knew it? So let's say that's a 20 standard deviation event, but we might get to that. What we're more going to focus on, if you look at, say, equity markets, every couple of years, the equity markets have a 10% correction. So that should be expected as a normal part of investing. But something as severe as, say, a 50% correction in equity markets, well, actually happens more often than you would think. We've had 3 in the last 50 years. So certainly any of your clients and yourself thinking about an investment horizon of 20 or 30 years should, in your thinking, say sometime in that time there's going to be a 50% correction. What will that mean for our clients? So, Shane, I'd like to sort of kick off with you if we can. And you wrote an article for Cuffelinks recently, a really great article on the 9 keys to successful investing. And number 5 was turn down the noise, okay? And yet you write an almost daily economic newsletter. So can you just sort of reconcile the turn down to noise and the production of such regular information?
That's a good question, and turn down the noise has become one of my favourite sayings, because I think we are inundated with noise, and every time I write that down I kind of think, am I actually contributing to the noise? And of course I am, in a way. What I think I was reminded by this reading the paper today. This week's time or so will be the 10th anniversary of Lehman Brothers failing. The iPhone only came onto the market in 2007. So it's been a phenomenon over the last 10 years since that period. In fact, I remember being in school holidays, October 2008, just after the TARP was passed in the US, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, if you remember that. And for some reason, my then BlackBerry would not connect to the system in Samoa, where I was on holidays. And that week, the Australian share market fell something like 19%. So in some ways, that was a good thing that I missed that, the worst part of it. And you could argue that in times when people didn't have all this information overload, it could result in more stable markets than the ones we have these days. But I do worry that the amount of information out there can cause a lot more volatility, probably make us worse investors, potentially make us more nervous investors, probably more cautious than perhaps we should be if we take alternatively a long-term view. But that's not to say that all information should be turned down. I think there is a lot of wisdom out there. There's a lot of publications that provide information which takes a step back, tries to put things in context, which I hope I try and do, and focus on ways to successfully invest. So I think, yes, it is very important to turn down the noise. Don't get obsessed with the nightly news, whatever happened on Wall Street last night or whatever. Try and put some perspective around it, and hopefully that's what we're going to try and do today.
Stephen, you contributing to the noise?
All the time. My God, I'm twittering like a lunatic. I'm addicted to Twitter, and I think that is the prime noise channel. I think a lot of the time. One of the things that's really clear, especially in the world of economics and financial economics, is that a lot of the stuff that you can write down in 800 words, like it's very hard to see like a deep contribution on a daily or weekly basis, but it's also true for people like us who are kind of into it and and are sort of professionally engaged in this stuff. You do need to keep a weather eye on a couple of major indices on a daily basis, that kind of thing. But freaking out and adjusting your portfolio based on some like 0.2% tick in the Japanese railway index or something, and you go, oh, it's over. That's maybe a bit too far, especially for the time horizon of the average super investor, right?
Okay, so turn it down, but keep your eye on what's happening.
Also, I'm there for the memes. Like, I'm just there for the cat gifs a lot of the time. I really just want more cats in my internet. I think that's important too.
So we do have a few live polls, and we will go to the first one if we can. If you could reach for your phones, thanks. So the first question here is, when do you expect a US recession to start? Shane wanted us to ask this one in particular. And Shane, do you want to elaborate on the question while people are opening their iPhones?
Well, just bear in mind that the median answer I will then say something different, just to be a contrarian. But there is a lot of talk about this, and it's amazing. The GFC was 10 years ago, and as you say, it was an almost existential issue coming out of that, as was the Eurozone crisis a few years later. But a lot of the debate now is that the US economy has become a lot stronger. It's used up spare capacity. The debate is what's going to turn it down again, because we know sooner or later, it tends to have recessions every 10 years. But I'm conscious that economic expansions, bull markets don't die of old age, they die of exhaustion. And so the critical question for me is, are we at exhaustion yet? And I'm still not totally convinced about that. I still think there's probably a bit further to go. But you'd have to say the US economy is closer to it than we in Australia are. Their unemployment rate is 3.9%. Doesn't usually go much lower than that. If you add in the underemployed, it's about 7.5%. In Australia, the unemployment rate is 5.3%. Add in the underemployed, it's about 13.9%. Very, very different situation in Australia, and indeed in many other parts of the world. But to me, it's always what happens in the US that is critically important here. And therefore, I think it is of use to sort of have some idea in your mind when the next recession will come, because history tells us that you get these 10% corrections, sometimes we get 20% corrections. I mean, who would remember that the US share market, top to bottom, intraday high to intraday low, in 2011 fell 21.5%. Now, most people don't count that as a bear market because it didn't close on those levels, but that's what happened. That was a major, major fall. But it was sort of several years ago now, mostly forgotten. But the question I always think, when you see those falls of 10% like earlier this year, 20%, are we going to go on and turn into a major, major bear market like the GFC, like 1974 when my favourite TV show, The Brady Bunch, was canned, and I can no longer fantasise about Marshall. I had to get that one in because people don't, well, I don't mention it, people complain. But that was a major, major bear market, or the tech wreck. All of those were associated with US recession. So if you're going to get that sort of bear market when the US recession comes is a critical issue. It's interesting to see there that well, you're all split on this, but interestingly, the majority see that happening by 2020, even though the most common response is post-2021.
So, Stephen, are you surprised by that? Does it accord with your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, the US economy has expanded incredibly rapidly. I think Chase is exactly right. The crucial number to look at is the underemployment number. That's at 7%. That can't really go to 4%. Like, there's so much friction in that market. It's such a large market. Where are the extra workers coming from? I guarantee you they don't want to work in America. from abroad, there's a fairly anti-migrant bias going on there at the moment. So all of a sudden, you're going to hit a capacity constraint with respect to labor. In the last session, we talked a lot about technological change. A lot of that's helping keeping it going. But in the financial markets, you have to say these are extremely leveraged positions. I would probably say 2020. If you're looking at processes that generally correct themselves over time, it looks like things will relax back to the kind of normal levels around then, unless there's been a massive structural change. And I don't see any evidence of that, especially in the financial markets.
So given that one of the charts that you put up in your session earlier today showed the US GDP as a proportion of the world, why are we so hung up about the US? Why is it still this global engine of growth? Why, for example, does Shane... Well, I'm wondering why, given that you put up the chart, why are we hung up about the US?
The US is the global exporter of ideas and technology at the moment. China is not. That will change at a certain point in time when their industrial capacity and particularly their university sector start really pumping out newer ideas. I have several PhD students who now work in China, and they have no budget constraints in those universities. They're just whatever you need to do to come up with a new grain of rice, that's what we'll give you. So they'll eventually converge to the technological frontier pretty quickly. And they're fighting very hard in particular sectoral battles like AI and things like this. But the US right now is the global exporter of world-class financial services, world-class ideas. They have 20 of the top world universities. That's why we care about it. They're also, if you like, at least for now, the bulwark of the world economic order. And so when they encounter trouble, economies deeply linked to them like Australia's need to be very, very aware of their changes. Small economies like Ireland as well, very, very, very attuned to changes. I mean, a very good example would be taxation policy in the United States. When the Trump administration changed its taxation policy, that was the headline on all of the newspapers and in all the news programs the next day in Ireland and across Europe. When there were major taxation changes in China last year as well, they didn't make the cut at all. And I think that kind of tells you a lot about how interconnected those economies are for the moment. I think that's going to change.
Shane, US?
Well, it's just reality. If I look back through history of share markets, if our market is going to have... I like to distinguish between, someone did this last year, a gummy bear market, which is where the market comes down quite a lot, but a year later it's back up again, and a grizzly bear market. A gummy bears, those things you put in your mouth and they taste kind of nice. Grizzly bears aren't so nice. So a grizzly bear is where you come down 20%, you think the sky's falling, but a year later you're back up again. But a year later you're down another 20% and the sky does fall. All of those in Australia, whether it's the 70s or the GFC, were associated with US recession. So that's just reality. And the reality is that in dollar terms, the US economy is still the world's biggest economy, and its cycle still has an impact. I mean, we worry about what the US share market did overnight. We don't pay that much attention to what the Chinese share market did overnight or through the day, or not the same degree of attention. And of course, in terms of capital markets, it's got the most advanced capital markets. So that's probably going to remain the reality for some time to come. Now, eventually it will transition to China, but there's a long way to go to get to that point.
Okay, so let's go to the second poll question, because this is relevant to where we are at the moment. And it'll be up in a second. What do you expect to be the main driver of the next bear market or economic downturn? And while people are doing that, we did have a question. Can I have the questions back up? Thanks. Can we separate an economic downturn from the capital markets? So if we get a recession, as we're talking about, a number of people or majority of people think that's going to be in the next 3 years. So in the sort of real economy, does that lead to an equity market fall as well?
I think you could separate You can separate the financial markets from the economy. 1987 was an example of that. The share markets went sky high and then they crashed back to where they were at the start of the year, mind you, but still very big falls, but there was no recession associated with that, and of course the markets then just moved on again. And when you look back through history, it doesn't seem like that big event. Obviously it did in October 2007, and that was a classic example of where you need to turn down the noise. If that was early in my career, I was 3 years into it, if I had choice in my superannuation, listened to all the noise that was around at that point in time, panicked and put it all in cash, and left it there, as people often do, for 2 years, my superannuation would be looking a lot less healthy than it does today. So I think superannuation is a classic example. You need to try and stay the course. But that was an example where financial markets disconnected from economic reality. But if there is an economic recession sometime in the next couple of years, I'd be 100% sure that share markets would fall by more than 20%, and it could well turn into a grisly bear market where you come down some more from that. Because that's just the way the cycle works, that if economic conditions deteriorate, you go into recession, profits fall, and share market discounts that. Now, a rational investor, you could argue, well, should not be so obsessed with short-term profit movements, but that's the way the reality in markets. When they see profits down 20 or 30%, they think, well, we've got to knock the share market down 20 or 30%, and that tends to be what happens. So I think you would see that happen. If the US goes into recession, say in 2020, then we're going to have a major bear market on the back of that.
So the issue, does it kick on from there, is the question we're asking as well.
Well, I think it would kick on to other countries around the world.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that Australia would go into recession on the back of that. We didn't go into recession in response to the tech wreck, the Asian crisis, the one 20 years ago. We didn't go into or the GFC. You've got to be a little bit careful there because population growth is so much stronger in Australia. If you look at things in a per capita terms, it's not quite as impressive. But I think we would be affected by that, and we would have to take account of it, as Stephen indicated. On the 2021, which is interesting because that was my base case for a US recession, because I think US probably can't go much further than it has, but it's going to take a while for inflationary pressures to build such that the Fed slams the brakes on to give us a downturn in 2020. But I'm thinking it may take a little bit longer. If you look at the rate at which wages growth is picking up in the US, it's going to take maybe 2 years before it becomes a problem at this rate of increase. And the other things aren't there. Historically, the US economy has had signs of excess in a whole bunch of other things: excessive building of housing, business investment, consumer durable spending. All those things are not there in the US, suggesting we're still a fair way off it yet. The other thing that worries me about forecasting a recession for 2020 is that's an election year, and I don't think the politicians are going to necessarily allow a recession to occur in that they would do something to sort of stave that off. So I'm leaning a little bit towards 2021, but at the moment it's still something I think to keep an eye on.
Okay.
Rather than start acting big time for it.
And Stephen, in your own assessment of the major drivers, we're interested in those, and there is a big other category in the vote. But given that we're already having the Fed increasing rates and indicating that they'll keep going, would you agree with some of those major signals?
It's interesting. I mean, just to go back one step, I think one of the things that the GFC taught us is how deeply interconnected the financial markets are with the rest of the world and with domestic markets. There's a process called financialization where the financial markets just become more and more and more important to everyone's lives. And you saw this when George W. Bush was president, the 401k issue where average people were all of a sudden shareholders, right? The super industry and all that. The average person now has a portfolio determination problem, which they never had before. So any change in the fortunes of the equity markets do actually have real economic effects. So there's a complexity issue, a concentration issue, and a coordination issue. All three of these things mash into the policy sphere where central bankers and fiscal policymakers do their thing. And what's interesting there is you guys have identified the one area where we know the most, actually. The Fed has said really, really clearly, subject to these fundamentals keeping going, we're going to keep interest rates going up. And they've said that, and it's been really clear. They couldn't really have been clearer. Powell's an extremely clear communicator. And similarly, in the UK, with Mark Carney, he said the same thing, right? And in the opposite direction, right? In the opposite direction, he said, whatever I need to do to stop, riots in the street from Brexit, I will do. Like, they've been really clear. So it's interesting. I would maybe like some people to come back on who put in other, what they think the other is. For me, the biggest worry actually is a trade war. The thing about trade wars are they always have severe unintended consequences, and they're very hard to unwrap, because the thing they erode fastest is not working capital or operating surpluses or anything else. They erode trust. You can't trust people. You can't trust people. You can't invest in productive capacity in their country if you think they're going to levy taxes on you and that kind of stuff. That's the hardest thing to replace with trade wars, and it's really interesting the degree to which real investment in places like the UK have fallen off a cliff simply because no one trusts the outcome to the policymakers. And so I would identify a trade war as being far more important than interest rate increases, simply because it's more of a risk that I don't understand. But I'd also be really, really interested to know what the other is in your minds, maybe via the text messages or whatever.
Okay. I must admit that an economist would sort of look at it and say it's the Fed. And historically, the Fed has kept going till there's an accident. If you look back through history, the Fed always keeps going, and then something goes wrong. Even you can say in the GFC, they kept going until the housing market in the US went bust. And they kept going into the late 1990s until the tech boom went bust. So that's the normal play out of things. But I must admit, in the very near term, it's the trade war that worries me the most. And I'm conscious also that we haven't had a real trade war since the 1930s.
Yeah.
There were some episodes, Japan and the US in the 80s. Nixon in 1971 raised tariffs on most imports to the US by 10%, and then it was reversed a little while later. Yeah. But the trust is the big one here, and I do worry that the relationship between the US and China, that trust is going downhill rapidly. They had a meeting back in May, and then within a couple of weeks, Trump had torn it up, basically. And I can understand why the Chinese are so wary now, because they think, well, we can't trust you. You said the trade war, your Treasury Secretary said the trade war had been put on hold. 2 weeks later, it's all back on again. So yeah. I think that's a really a big issue to keep an eye on. Now, the optimist in me tells me that Trump is just bluffing. The art of the deal, all that sort of stuff. I'm a little bit sensitive about Trump because my son keeps teasing me and says my haircut looks like Donald Trump, and I try to come back and say, well, that's nonsense, Bodie. His name's Bodie. I said, that's pure nonsense. Donald Trump's part is down here, mine is up here. And he says, oh, well, give it a few years.
And you wear more colourful ties as well.
Yeah, I have more colourful ties, but... And I'm always conscious, Trump's tie is always down here somewhere, and I've always got to make sure I haven't got it as long as Trump's is. But anyway, all sorts of things around that. But in any case, I'm a little bit sensitive about Trump, but it does worry me what's going on there. I thought he was bluffing. I thought, oh, he's done his bluffing now, they're going to negotiate. Next thing I know, it's back on again. And I kind of wonder whether he's opened a bit of a Pandora's box in the US of anti-China sentiment. There's always a degree of anti-foreign sentiment, which is a negative thing. And therefore he lost control. He was criticised by his supporters, and then he went back the other way and said he doubled down on it. So this does concern me a little bit. Hopefully, I think they'll all see common sense. Maybe when you go to Walmart and see prices have gone up 20%, there'll be a backlash against Trump. That's what I'm hoping.
Well, I couldn't understand was Harley Davidson. You guys saw all this, right? Harley Davidson was half their stuff is they said we're going to make a lot of the components of our motorcycles that we sell in Europe because of the tariffs. And Trump went mad. And he said, no, you got to make them all here. And they were like, why would we do that? And then the workers who are just about to lose their jobs, from this process because of the thing that Trump had done, they were kind of. This is the reality of it. The reality of it is, if you have a situation where people are getting thrown out of their jobs in iconic companies, because of these tariffs, I think that will be the really big change. And again, it's always unexpected. I come back to the Brexit thing. Brexit is a kind of a trade war. It's a kind of a terms of trade shock in a way. And a lot of people are getting upset about insulin. it turns out that a lot of insulin is not made in the UK, and if you're a diabetic, insulin's pretty important, right? So it turns out that they really need to worry about this, and it's that kind of thing. It's a very human, very a clear story of people being made worse off by a really technocratic change.
Yeah. Sorry, if we can move on from trade, because we have done a bit on that, because the questions are all coming and we've got to get to them. Okay, so let's address some of those. Please keep them coming. Thanks for sending them in. Are you worried that the trouble we are seeing in emerging markets will continue and spread to OECD countries? Jane?
Yes. I'm not totally convinced it's going to spread to developed countries, but I am conscious that these things can go on for a while. We saw it continuing last night. A lot of capital has flowed into the emerging world over the last few years. Out of interest, Argentina, I think, was one of the strongest share markets last year, up something like 70%. Now this year it's one of the weakest. So a lot of money did flow in. It wasn't so much into public debt, like it was 20 odd years ago, but it was more private debt. And of course, now you've got this situation with Donald Trump trying to make America great again. Of course, he has no understanding of economics, but if you want to make America great again, that means and you cut taxes and you increase spending, then the American economy accelerates relative to everybody else. You suck in imports. There's one thing, your trade deficit gets worse, which is now happening in the US. Of course, he was going to blame the Chinese and everybody else, but it's really those stimulatory policies causing that. But the other thing that's happened when you make America great again is that your currency goes higher, because the Fed arguably has to raise interest rates more than would otherwise be the case, and so on. And that is putting immense pressure on the emerging world. As the US dollar goes up, they've got a lot of US dollar denominated debt, mainly private sector. This is not 1997, very different situation, but it's private sector debt, and that's creating debt servicing problems. At the same time, you've got trade threats. That worries emerging countries as well, given their exposure to global trade, and you've got a slowdown in China. And so you can sort of understand why these concerns are starting to flare up. I thought the concerns over the last few years regarding the emerging world were overdone, but I am a little bit more concerned this one has a bit further to go. And I'm also conscious that this is September, and when you get to September, October, August, September, October, you always start talking about anniversaries, 87, 1929, GFC, Asian crisis, and so on. It's sort of I'm usually pretty upbeat about things. That's why I've got the bright tie on usually. But I do get worried about this time of year. Seasonally, it's often a rougher period for share markets. So I think between now and the end of the year, we could have a bit of a rough ride, and the emerging market situation is likely to be a contributor to that.
Okay, Stephen, we'll go on to another question rather than have every one of you, both of you do every question. So for you, given populist forces globally and the ability of those forces to aggregate votes, if there is a serious global event, what will, rather than should, happen? So you've got global,
Okay, so I think we need to do two things. First off, great question. Probably what's really interesting is, I don't know if you guys watch stand-up comedians. They're brilliant bellwether. The things they find funny, the kinds of jokes that they make are very good bellwethers. So right now everybody's like, why would I have children when the world will end? You know, this kind of stuff. It's all very apocalyptic, but in a funny way. Trust me, it was funny. So the populism. So first off, what is populism? My definition of populism is pretending that the constraints that bind the current rulers won't bind you when you get into power. You know, they say, the Italians, Salvini et al. Say, no, we're constrained by fiscal rules because we're in the euro. But when I get into power, I'm such a tough guy, and I'm gonna fix it, and we're gonna be able to spend loads of money, and I'll drop your taxes. There'll be a budget deficit, but it'll be grand. Right, you see it in other places. In Hungary, populists there say, the big problem is there's people out there trying to get us, and so what we need to do is, we need to concentrate all power in one or two hands. Turkey is another really good example. The economy is collapsing. What do I need to do? Borrow a load of money, stuff the households, the corporate sector, the banks with cash that I'm fairly sure won't get paid back. And by the election that way. Populism is popular, particularly when before they get the reins. before they get the reins. Populism is very difficult to maintain once you have the reins of power because those constraints do bind. There's only two countries where they don't bind, the US and China. Why? Because those people make the rules. So you can change those things. The US is in a very specific position. You can have a populist who will say, I will drop taxes and spend more. My budget deficit will explode, precisely as Shane has said. But that doesn't matter because we are who we are. If you're in Australia or Ireland, it's very, very different. So what are the prospects for managing a really big crisis? The key issue that I have with populism, and as I defined it, a lot of people define populism as what I don't like. You know, it's like, oh, that's very neoliberal. What does that mean? Neoliberal. It means a thing I don't like, you know, and similarly populism. Populism, as I've defined it, is essentially a theory of non-binding constraints. So populism doesn't work when you're in office. It's very, very, very hard to maintain because you generate a crisis. Right? How do you do? I presume the large crisis you're talking about is like a trade war, or maybe climate change or something like that. The truth about it is, populists can coexist with technocrats. You can have a populist prime minister or a populist president, and they can say kind of fairly nutty stuff, and that'll be okay if you have a functioning set of technocratic institutions underneath them that they don't try to erode. The problem is when the populist tries to erode the institutions, either through stuffing them full of incompetent bureaucrats or by eroding things that generate more trust, like the media. That's where there's a bigger worry. But in terms of actually addressing these issues, like I'm an optimist, like Shane. I actually think a large number of these issues are being addressed. The Paris Climate Accord, for example. Trump made a big deal about pulling out of it, but the reality is he's still in it till 2020, right? The reality of it is these climate targets are still binding, and I think that you have to look beyond what populists say and what they do and the constraints that bind them. And once you do that, you actually find that things are a lot calmer and a lot less noisy.
So Shane, this is more of a domestic question. What do you make of the increased wholesale funding cost increases for the banks, given the level of indebtedness of our households, and is this a material issue?
It's a minor issue. If you allow for the fact that the banks get about 60-65% of their funding from their depositors, we're only talking about the remaining 30 or 35% or so that's been affected by this increased cost in funding. Now, the increased cost in funding is about 20 basis points, so it often refers to the gap between the bank bill rate, and this gets kind of technical, and the expected cash rate in Australia. And at the moment, it's about 45 basis points. The norm was about 20 basis points. So cost of funding is running about 20, 30 basis points higher than normal for the banks when they go to the money markets, or even if you go globally and borrow, you've still got to hedge it back so the money markets still count. And that adds about 10 basis points when you multiply it all out to their borrowing costs, and if it's passed on, it's about 10 basis points, which I think is what the average bank has done, roughly. I know there's headline numbers all over the place, but it's about 10 basis points. So it's not a huge move. For someone who's used to watching interest rate moves by central banks, the Fed, the RBA, and so on, that's a much, much bigger impact on what happens to Australians with their mortgages. And I don't think this is enough at present. But what I do worry about is that we've got a drought, which is that's going to be a bit of a drag, 0.5% or so. We've got that slight increase in mortgage costs. We've got falling house prices generally, and we've got the peak in the housing cycle. And they suggest to me that we're in an environment where the Reserve Bank would be making a big mistake if they started raising interest rates, despite their innate optimism and despite the fact that yesterday GDP numbers were quite good.
So, Stephen, you talked earlier about household debt and this bank funding issue. Is sort of quasi-tightening of monetary policy. The Westpac increase was 15 basis points. Does your concern about household debt kick in at those modest changes, or are you more concerned if it was, a longer-term rise in rates?
So I think what that's the Reserve Bank now. Hello, Philip. No, it's. I think what is really clear to me is at higher and higher levels of debt, you become more and more fragile. The household sector becomes more fragile, and the banking sector becomes more fragile to any small shock. And I think that's the real key here. The real key is not that large changes matter. It's that when you're in a fragile situation, small changes matter. Now, I actually agree about the wholesale funding thing. There is a sufficient market power in the banking system to pass this on to consumers. There's a sufficient amount of disposable income to absorb that at the moment. But again, any kind of employment shock, that becomes an issue for banks, and it becomes an issue for policymakers. And you don't want to be in this situation. You don't want to be in the situation where the largest element in your economy is fragile. And the largest asset class in your economy is more and more fragile. You want to be able to make sure that at least the banks are able to keep going. Because believe me, you don't want to be in a situation where the banks get in trouble, the government bails out the banks, then the government's in trouble, and then everyone comes back to you going, God, lads, you really messed that up. And the household sector has to do the bailing out. It's not fun.
So Shane, just before we come to you, let's go to the third and final poll question, because we're on this subject of housing. And the question is, do you expect a house price crash in Australia? So let's call a crash, say, 20% from the current levels, given that we've already had in our major markets probably a 5%. But Shane, did you want to add something?
I mean, this is a critical issue for Australia, but it has been for a while. You may recall an Australian academic economist selling his house in the latter part of last decade and predicting a crash, and then he had to walk to Mount Kosciuszko when that crash did not eventuate. Right. Prices just went back up again. So there's long been an issue in Australia regarding the fragility of housing, very rapid growth in household debt and house prices relative to income, starting in the mid-1990s, going into last decade, and then again going further this decade. And yet Australia has remained relatively resilient through that. Now, I'm not an optimist on Sydney and Melbourne property prices. I think they're going to come off another 10% or so. So not a crash, but they're going to come off more. And the Reserve Bank would be, again, making a huge mistake raising interest rates in that environment. Because don't forget, the last two times property prices fell in Australia to any degree, 2008 and 2012, those price declines were arrested by the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates, and then the property market took off again. At the moment, the Reserve Bank's not talking about cutting interest rates, so I think there is more downside to come. But I would tend to agree with the response there, 70-odd% saying no crash, simply because to get a crash in Australia of prices, property prices, you'd need either much higher interest rates, I think, maybe 0.15 is equivalent to 0.25% rate hike 10 years ago, so monetary policy is now more potent. But I think you'd need to have, say, 1 or 2% increase, or maybe 2% increase in mortgage rates to get that, or much higher unemployment. And I don't think we're going to get either of those two things, so therefore I'm not in the property price crash camp. The other thing to note is there's been a lot of times where property prices have come down in Australia. In Sydney in the early 1990s, St Ives, what have you, they came off about 10%, 5 to 10% falls in each of 2005, 2008, 2012, and yet they turned out to be soft landings. The only real hard landing in the Australian property market in our history, in the last century, is if you go back to the 1930s. You had a massive run up through the 1920s, had the Great Depression, property prices came down, and then had a huge leap down when the midget submarines got into Sydney Harbour and all the people in Potts Point decided to move to Bowral because they didn't want to get their house blown up by midget submarines. But I think that's what happened anyway. But prices came down heavily then. Then you had a massive post-war boom. Property prices had several falls through that period, but there was no real hard landing. So Australia has been a little bit different to other countries which haven't had that hard landing that the US saw and others. And I'm also conscious, despite all the stuff we hear, the deterioration in lending standards hasn't been quite as bad or anywhere near as bad as what you saw in the US. Maybe you got these interest-only loans. That is a big risk, I reckon, but at least they were given to people who have a job. They're not ninja loans. No income, no job, no asset, people living in trailer parks. Very, very different situation. We also have full recourse loans. You borrow $400,000, it's irrelevant what the value of the house is. It could be $350,000, you still got to pay back $400,000. You can't put your keys in the mail, jingle mail. You can't do that in Australia. Again, I think that imparts a degree of resilience to our market. So, yes, I'm concerned about it. Yes, the Reserve Bank can't raise interest rates. Yes, there's a chance the next move might be a cut, but I'm not in the camp that says there's going to be a property crash in Australia.
So we have two economists, so we normally have at least three opinions, but in this one we seem to have a very strong difference of opinion because by your own test earlier, Stephen, you should be about 100 metres in that direction from someone saying there's a soft landing in property.
Yeah, soft landings are not things. To be fair to Shane, I think what he's talking about is changes in the growth rate of house prices and not the level. Right.
Oh, no. Sydney and Melbourne are going to be down 15% from their high. They're already off about 5%.
Yeah.
They've got another 10% to go, 15%. So that's probably the worst fall for a capital city aggregate than you've had since the 1930s.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's a hard landing.
Well, it depends. It depends when you buy, right? But no,
it's tough for them.
So let's start where we agree. I totally agree with you on the monetary policy thing. I don't think the RBA is going to. It would be mad to increase interest rates given how fragile the household sector is and the corporate sector as well, which is quite indebted in certain sectors. I think the real risk is an employment shock. So you have a situation where a large employer pulls out, that changes expectations in a certain area, that causes a house price fall, and because they're all concentrated in a certain area, people start to get worried, dump the stuff on the markets, that kind of thing.
Well, we had that in Port Hedland.
Yes, and you had it. You had it in Melbourne in the early 19th century as well. There was a huge land bank bought up. There was a huge property crisis. It wiped out half the banks in Australia. So it's not that it can't happen here. It did, and I would be very remember that you generated a soft landing, so called, by extremely accommodative monetary policy, which you kind of can't do anymore unless you go negative into interest rates. The RBA is not going to go negative because it's going to hurt the banks and very large depositors to do so.
But they've still got 150 basis points to zero.
But that in order to save very wealthy Sydney and Melbourne householders, they're going to have to do something drastic. And again, like you said, central bankers are typically too cautious, and then they pile in, and so the chances of them making a mistake are too high.
To their credit, the RBA has a habit of that. They made a huge mistake in 2008. They were raising interest rates on the back of the banks doing out-of-cycle interest rates going into 2008 when we were going to the global financial crisis. They were raising rates. By September, they'd realised, well, we've been stupid, and they were cutting rates 75 basis points a time, unlike the Europeans, which were extremely slow to react. So the RBA does have a history of changing direction quickly. They might take a little bit longer to get there, but they will change. The other thing I reckon you need to understand about Australia, and this is odd, when I grew up, when I was watching the Brady Bunch on NBN Channel 3 back in the 70s, everything, when it boomed, everything was booming. Sydney, Perth, the whole lot, they're all booming at the same time. Every sector in the economy just about was booming, to the extent that a sector might boom. So much of services doesn't, but everything was going at the same time. Now when you look at Australia, you do a graph of all the sectors, it looks like spaghetti. There's this bit's up, this bit's down. You go to one part of Australia, they're feeling really happy, never been better. Another part of Australia, it's terrible. I've never seen anything as bad as this. So that, in a way, is a very good thing, because you've got this very low correlation across parts of the economy, which to a degree imparts a degree of stability. So what I reckon a lot of those people missed back in 2012, you read those gloomy, doomy newsletters saying Australia was heading for a bust once the mining boom comes to an end. They missed the fact that New South Wales and Victoria had been in virtual recession for several years. And as soon as you cut interest rates starting 2011 and the Aussie dollar came down, then that part of Australia bounced back. Manufacturing, tourism, higher education, and so on, even the housing sector, of course. And just as the other part of Australia, mining, was going into a huge hole. Now you've got the situation where housing is up here, it's going to come down. Shock horror, that's going to be terrible. Rough time for Sydney and Melbourne homeowners who bought recently particularly. But you've got other parts of Australia, mining, for example, which is pretty well near the bottom. and they're going to start picking up again. So I think that's a factor you need to allow for in Australia, and partly explains why we've gone 27 years without a recession. Some sectors have had serious recessions, others have offset that.
Okay, in the remaining time before lunch, let's go to the heart of the investing issue. What's your top tip for funds before you both leave the stage? Let's go with you first, Stephen.
My top tip for funds?
Yeah, so you're an asset allocator, you're a portfolio manager, and you've gone into investment committee and you've got the big idea to put in front of them.
Oh, okay, right. So my big idea would be to think in terms of negatives. So don't buy Turkish debt, and don't spend your time working on sectors that you don't understand. I think that's really, really important. A lot of people thought they understood mining, for example. They thought it was a capex play, and it's not. And so, for like a really, really good thing is just decide what you're not going to do. Don't have a to-do list, have a to-don't list. Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay, and Shane, as well as being chief economist, you're an asset allocator. So what's your number one?
Well, you've got to look for things that are underloved and undervalued. And this sounds really perverse given what I said earlier. That is starting to appear in the emerging world. There's a lot of fallout here, innocent bystanders getting whipped up and their share markets are coming down and their currencies are collapsing. I think it's too early right now, because I think this contagion thing has a little bit further to play out. But I would keep powder dry at the moment. If you've got cash or whatever, bonds or something, you'd be looking for that opportunity there. Because if you look at the PE, the forward PE on emerging market shares is about 10 times. This is pretty cheap. China is way below. Its valuation is way below where it was when it bottomed out after that 50% fall going to 2016. So I think you've got to look. That's where the value is. That's where investments are underloved and undervalued, and pretty soon they're going to be oversold. Would I go there just yet? Would I go with that recommendation right now? No, I'd say wait a little bit. But that'd be what I'd be looking for.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. We are out of time. A reminder, if you can, to find a moment to rate the session. And as with other sessions, the thank you to the speakers is a gift donation to the First Nations Foundation, which is supported by Holding Redlich. Lunch is coming up, supported by Robico. Shane, Stephen, thanks for a lively session. I wish we had another hour, but thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.